So we're going to look first at the relationship between the prep and the opposing teeth. So you can see where the opposing ridges are.
Right.
So they're pretty close to where the grooves are now. So as we've done before, we're going to estimate where the grooves will be on the A-plane reduction. And that's pretty close to where we want to be. So we start by making those grooves exactly where the opposing tooth tells us to put the grooves.
Right.
And then we're going to make everything from the embrasure to the groove, from this groove to this groove, and from this groove to this embrasure, as rounded as we need to, and make sure we get the clearance. Now I'm going to move the buccal groove more to the distal. And now you can see it needs to go more to the distal. The distal buccal groove looks pretty good. So again, it's always a matter of fitting the prep to the opposing tooth. So if we're doing a regular onlay or a full gold crown or a 3/4 crown, whatever we're doing, ultimately, other than an inlay, this is the way we're going to start.
Is it similar to the crown cutting, doctor, on the posterior, the PFN? We were also...
I'll repeat what I just said.
Okay.
Whether we're doing a onlay or a 3/4 crown or a full gold crown, this is the way we start.
Okay.
So we start by getting the clearance on the A plane that we need. So we have clearance there. Then we're going to go and do the B plane. Point the burr in the right direction as you've seen before. Come out the facial groove, come down here to the distal facial groove, and come down here. Plane 1, plane 2, plane 3. Then we're going to shift around a little bit more and then do the ridge over here. All the way down to the marginal ridge right next to the adjacent tooth, and then down here. Out the facial groove. Flat plane to the marginal ridge, flat plane, out the facial groove, flat plane, out the facial groove, flat plane to the distal buccal groove, and then flat plane down the distal cusp. We can look in this direction and get an idea how much clearance we're getting, and we can need a little bit more. But we can also measure it with a ball burnisher, whatever we want to do. And then we're going to do the mesiolingual cusp. Well, let's do the distal lingual cusp first because we need to get clearance with that one. We're going to use bite wax or bite registration material, anything that measures the clearance indirectly, to make sure that we have got the clearance that we need on the distal lingual cusp. The tip of the burr is following the direction of this ridge right here. So that'll give us a pretty good relationship between the cusp that we're cutting and the opposing tooth. Then we're going to cut the mesiolingual cusp so that we get 1 millimeter of reduction. We don't care about clearance on this because it had clearance already. We're going to reduce it so that the lab's going to rebuild this cusp to the original height with 1 millimeter of gold over it. If we're doing a occlusal reduction for ceramic, we're going to do it exactly the same way. We're just going to get more clearance and more reduction. Okay, so this is the basic occlusal reduction that we're going to do. We can see we got some clearances on the A and the B plane. The distal lingual cusp we have to measure indirectly, but I think it's pretty close. Okay, so now, if we were doing an onlay, probably there would already be a box there. There would probably already be 2 boxes on this tooth. And they'd be on the mesial and distal side. So I'm going to go ahead and make boxes on the mesial and distal sides. I'm not going to be terribly concerned about how big they are, because if we're doing an onlay, we're doing the onlay because we're doing the occlusal coverage because these boxes are pretty big. And they're weakening the surrounding tooth structure. enough so that we need to do a crown to protect the surrounding tooth structure. So I'm just going to make some boxes with the normal burr that we used for class 2s.
Right.
Then we're going to come back later with a different burr and make these boxes work for an onlay. Now even these boxes aren't going to be as big as you'd typically find in a patient on a tooth that requires crown coverage, but I don't care particularly about how big these are right now. An ideal onlay preparation with small boxes is meaningless clinically, because when you have small boxes, you haven't weakened any of the tooth, so it doesn't need a crown.
Right.
Okay, so here we are with some just random boxes like that. And, you know, typically at the beginning, when you start doing an onlay preparation on a tooth, I can get my mannequin little guy to cooperate a little bit, yeah. Typically, there would be some sort of an isthmus to start with. If there's originally a class 2, there'd be some sort of isthmus to start with. So typically, there's going to be this much missing tooth structure because of the boxes in the isthmus. So of course, when we did the occlusal reduction, we wouldn't have anywhere near as much to reduce, huh? So we did the occlusal reduction on the entire tooth, but this is all we'd have to reduce if it were something that needed to have a crown on it, because it had a lot of missing tooth structure.
So isthmus has to be made after the occlusal reduction, right, doctor? Or
no, the point is the isthmus was already there. It was already there.
Yeah.
Okay? The boxes were already there. And the reason that we're doing a crown is because there was a big isthmus and big boxes, a lot of weakened tooth structure, so we need to do a crown. Okay? Now, in the prep that we do for an onlay, for example, we might very well use that isthmus, and we might even need to make an isthmus for reasons that we can talk about another time. Okay, so in any event, here's just basically some missing tooth structure because of an MOD. We have gingival clearance on both sides.
Right.
But now we need to make use of the missing tooth structure to support a crown. Okay? So instead of doing axe reductions, chamfers, and tapers all the way around, we're just going to use the missing tooth structure to support a crown. Okay, so we're going to make these boxes, obviously facial-lingually, the boxes have to diverge so that we can, so they do draw, so we can get the gold in and out. And the axial walls have to converge so that the relationship between those two walls is such that, again, they draw. The isthmus, if we're going to maintain that isthmus, we want to make sure that the facial-lingual walls of the isthmus diverge occlusally. So let's start by leaning, this is the tapered fissure burr, the 170L. Let's start by leaning it a little bit away from our eye, lingually, and a little bit axially. And cut this corner, this wall. And we're going to lean it toward our eye, still axially, but also facially, and recut this wall. So this is exactly the way we look, the position that we're in when we're doing any kind of a class 2. It's just going to be a little more careful about the vertical angulation. So now the facial and lingual walls diverge occlusally. I can see the lingual wall, I can see the facial wall. Let's do the same thing over on the other side. Again, and again, I'm leaning the burr axially and lingually to recut this wall over here on the lingual side. Then I'm going to lean it axially and facially toward myself and recut the wall over here on the facial side. So again, it's very much like working in a box of a class 2, but we're going to have a different vertical angle. In a class 2, we just keep the burr vertical all the time. This burr has a built-in divergence, and we're also going to create a little extra divergence. So now when I look down the distal box, I can see the lingual wall and the facial wall at the same time. When I look down the mesial box, I see the distal wall, or the facial lingual walls at the same time. If I look down the mesial buccal wall, I can see it and the distal lingual wall at the same time. I can see the distal buccal and the mesial lingual at the same time. Now I'm going to turn this way a little bit and make sure that the isthmus. Now there is a reason for doing an isthmus on a onlay preparation, even if we don't have an isthmus left from the original class 2. And I won't go into the details of that right now, but they are on my lecture on onlays, and that's online. So there is a good reason for making sure there's a good connection between those two boxes, and that the buccal lingual walls of the isthmus do diverge occlusally. Okay, so now we have another requirement that we have to meet when we're doing any kind of an onlay or inlay. Anything that's partial coverage in gold, even a 3/4 crown, we need to make sure that the margins of the facial lingual walls here, these proximal margins, that we have access to them. We have enough clearance so we can burnish the gold at those margins, and that the angle of the gold is small enough so it allows itself to be burnished. So we're going to put the burr back in the corner of the box here, which we decided, okay, that's a reasonable angulation axially and facially. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep that same angle, and I'm going to cut another cut here. This is called a flare. We're changing the exit angle at the margin all the way down to the gingival. I'm leaning the burr lingually facially and axially. And I'm cutting a flare. I might cut half the wall or even more, but that gives me more access for burnishing, and it gives me a small angle of gold at that margin so it can be burnished. I'll do the same thing over here on the distal buccal. So I'm going to put the burr back in the corner, use that same vertical angle, and start cutting. Notice I'm always looking in the direction I want to cut. And then I'm cutting away from my eye or toward my eye. That allows me to know that I'm cutting in exactly the right direction. So now on the distal buccal, I have the corner and I have the flare on top of it. Now on the mesial, on the this corner over here, now we're going to cut. I'm putting the burr back in the corner, and I'm going to come up to the top, and I'm going to cut from the inside out toward my eye. Get clearance so I have access for burnishing. Get a small angle of gold at the margin so I can burnish the gold. Okay, so now I have a corner and a flare, and a corner and a flare, and over here I've got the corner and the flare. Now I have to flare this one over here. So I'm going to put the burr back in the corner. This one I'm going to cut from the outside in. So I'm going to put the burr in the corner, make sure I have the axial and lingual angles that I want. The taper axially and lingually, and then I'm going to start cutting on the outside. All the way down to the bottom. Okay, so now I have to tighten the type it down a little bit. Okay, so now I have all of the proximal margins. I've got the boxes so that they draw. I've got retention. As long as I have walls that are tall enough, like if you have 3mm wall heights, you've got some retention that's working pretty well. I'm going to flatten the gingival floor all the way to the margin here.
And this is the same 55 burr, right?
170L, the tapered Fisher burr. Totally different from the 55 burr, isn't it?
Oh, because it is leaning, yeah.
It's a tapered Fisher burr, yeah. Okay, now I'm going to bevel the lingual cusp here, because that's the final margin, and I'm going to bring that bevel into the top of the flare here. I'm going to bevel the lingual cusp ridge along through here, make the final margin so the gold will be a small angle there so I can burnish the gold readily along the lingual cusp ridge. I'm going to finish the A-plane of the occlusal reduction at a 45-degree angle when I come around this corner, and a 45-degree angle over here, because once we've done the proximal reduction, in this case with boxes, we've done this for full crowns as well.
Right.
You know, for the full crown, you have a chamfer in the proximal area. Here you're going to have just
Boxes.
Just the boxes, yeah. And so I'm going to smooth the A-plane a little bit. I'm going to try to get the margin fairly straight and horizontal all the way across that facial surface. But I'm going to make sure that A-plane comes around the corner of the 45-degree angle there. Now I'm going to make the gold stronger, because when the gold comes over this buccal cusp, it comes down to that buccal margin, and it's a little bit thin as it approaches that buccal margin.
Okay.
So we're going to make the gold a little thicker near that margin by making a step called an offset. I'm going to lean the burr toward the top of the cusp, and I'm going to make this little step. That makes the gold thicker in that area, so it strengthens the gold near that margin. And notice that I'm saving a little bevel. Between the offset and the margin, there's a bevel. In this case, it's a nice 45-degree bevel all the way along. So again, when I have a small angle of gold at the margin, which I do because I have the bevel, then I can burnish the gold at the facial margin all the way along here as well. So any burnished gold margin is going to be a way better adapted margin than we can get in any other way. Even in a cast gold margin, this is stepping up the quality. So I'm going to put the burr parallel to the flare here, and then make that bevel join the top of the flare. We have to have smooth, continuous margins all the way around, just like you do for any crown prep. Put the burr parallel to the flare, bring the bevel into the top of the flare there. So now we have smooth, continuous margins and good exit angle, good angles all the way, the proximal walls, the facial wall, the proximal over here, and all the way around the lingual. The only thing I haven't done is make a gingival bevel. We'll make a gingival bevel precisely the same way we did for a gingival bevel on a Class 2 composite. But we can use this burr. As long as we have enough clearance, we can use this burr. So I'm going to put the burr against the flare right here. I'm going to cut gingerly right at the flare, just like we do with a different burr for making the bevel on the Class 2 composite.
Yeah, this is, that's the power connection.
Come down the flare, and then away from the flare there, come down the flare here, and away from the flare over here. When the bevels come from the facial and the lingual and they get to the middle, they join each other. Now we have a continuous bevel all the way across here. So at the bottom of the flares, I have a bevel joining the bottom, just like I have a bevel joining the top.
Right.
Do the same thing over here. So I'll put the burr parallel to the flare, cut gingerly right here. I'm going to make the bevel big enough so I can avoid hitting the adjacent tooth. Put the bevel over here. A little bit hard for the light to get in there. Let's turn things a little bit. So let's bring the bevel, I'm going to turn it a little bit more. So I can put the bevel, put the burr parallel to the flare here, cut gingerly right there. And then away from that flare toward the middle. So now, as long as we have the occlusal reduction that we need, as long as we have a good thickness of gold between the two boxes, as long as we have draw facial lingually, let's check this by looking down in the mirror. As long as we have draw facial lingually between the facial lingual walls of the boxes and the facial lingual flares, as long as we have draw facial lingually between the isthmus walls. Now I'm going to lean the facial wall of the isthmus, I think I'm going to lean it facially a little bit more, just to make sure we have draw in that area. As long as we have smooth continuous margins all the way around, as long as we have strengthened the gold at the facial margin by putting in an offset. And again, smooth continuous margins all the way around. So check the bevel over here. It makes a smooth connection into this flare. We could even make it a little smoother if we wanted. Smooth connection to the gingival bevel on the bottom of the flare. Smooth connection between the gingival bevel and the bottom of this flare. Smooth connection between the facial bevel and the top of that flare. Same thing with the facial bevel on the top of this flare. Same thing with the gingival bevel here and the bottom of that flare. And the gingival bevel on the bottom of this flare coming back up to the top again. So 360 degrees, smooth continuous margins all the way around. So any prep that we ever do for any restorative material, you need to have smooth continuous margins all the way around. That's what we have now. So I said I'm going to lean this facial out facially a little bit more. We could come back and smooth up the pulpal floor. We can put a little bevel on the axial pulpal line angles and things like that. But mostly we've got everything done the way it needs to be done. Okay, so that's the basic principle of an classic MOD onlay. And if we had to extend onto a facial or lingual surface and make a chamfer that might connect to the boxes in any of these areas, then that extension onto the buccal surface, for example, we might call it an MODB onlay.
Right.
Okay.
MODB. Okay. If that
And we also have the possibility of doing an onlay that doesn't cover all these cusps. It doesn't cover all four, in which case we might be doing something that's basically an inlay that covers 1 or 2 or 3 cusps. That would be an inlay onlay. So there's a variety of different solutions to the clinical problems that we might encounter as we look in the patient's mouth. And we have different choices for doing that. Again, if we had some decay in a buccal pit out here and some fractured enamel around through here, we might just do a chamfer in this area that comes all the way around, and the chamfer, of course, would make a smooth connection to the gingival bevel right in that area. Okay, so we could do that just for fun. So again, this would be a little less conservative than a traditional MOD onlay, but it might be something that would be necessary to do in a particular clinical situation. So we might do a chamfer.
That's fine then. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm making a typical chamfer with the typical taper parallel to the middle third of the adjacent tooth, starting in the facial groove, extending around here. We're going to rotate our view a little bit more so we can see it as it comes around the corner into the proximal. Keep the end of the burr at the margin so we have a nice 1/2 millimeter chamfer. And we're going to make that chamfer join the gingival bevel.
Okay.
So now we have that taken care of. We could even do a secondary plane up here. And now the facial margin of the onlay comes along here, and we're going to have it drop over into this area right here. We could even make, for more retention, we can even cut like a groove here with that burr and get a little more retention right in there. But again, now we have to double check our draw. So we have to make sure that if I look down the facial wall, I can see the facial wall of the prep here. I can see the facial wall here. If I look down this direction, I want to make sure I can see this wall on the side of that sort of semi-groove kind of affair, and then what's happening over here. We need to make sure we see those converging at the same time. And make a nice smooth surface over here, although it's not the margin. Anyway, so that you'd call an MODB onlay. That's one particular style of that.
That we did MODB. So because there was a buccal DB.
That would be exactly right.
Yes.
Okay,
Okay.
so that's, again, that's a little different design than you'll see in a textbook, but that's the kind of thing that you might very well need to be doing clinically.
Okay.
So we got to keep those things in mind.